Infrastructure is not about projects. It's about continuity. It's about country. It's also about how a system holds together over time and what happens when they don't. Because most of what we've talked about in this series is something people rarely see directly. Not because it isn't important, but because it usually stays in the background. Over the last 5 videos, we've tried to build a clearer picture of something that most people rarely think about directly. Infrastructure. I know, not a buzzword. Not as a political talking point, but as the underlying system that supports everyday life. We started with what infrastructure actually is. How roads, water systems, power grids, communication networks, and industrial systems are not separate things, but interconnected layers of a single system. When we looked at what happens when those systems starts to fail, and how problems often don't appear suddenly, but build slowly over time. We talked about cost, not just the prices of building things, but the cost of delay, the cost of neglect, and the cost of doing nothing at all. We also looked at the fact that even when people agree on the problem, they don't always agree on the solution. Because infrastructure sits at the intersection of economy, politics, engineering, and public trust. And that makes it complicated. Not because the core idea is unclear, but because the system itself is so large, so fragmented, and so long-term in its scope. Before ending this series, I want to be clear about something. This is not presented as a perfect answer. It's not a finished solution. And it's not meant to suggest that every proposed policy in this space is correct. The policy I have referenced throughout this series is one way of framing the problem. It's definitely not the only way. And it may not even be the right way. I chose it because it tries to take a broad view of infrastructure, one that connects roads, energy, water, broadband, housing, and industrial capacity into a single conversation. And because it tries to focus on practical outcomes rather than ideology. But reasonable people can disagree on priorities, on method, on funding, on timelines, and on what the trade-offs are, and if those trade-offs are acceptable. And that's not a weakness in the conversation, it's just part of it. Welcome to my channel, I'm not in Kansas anymore, where we focus on policy over politics. And if you value this kind of nonpartisan common sense analysis, feel free to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And as always, there's a full policy PDF in the description if you want to explore the framework in more details. If anything, what I hope this series has done is slow the conversation down just enough to make the system itself more visible. Because once you see how interconnected everything is, it becomes harder to treat any single piece of it in isolation. Infrastructure is not just about the projects. It's about maintenance. It's about decisions made over a long period of time and eventually shapes the world we live in today. And if there is one idea I would leave you with, it is this. If America is truly one of the most advanced countries in the world, then its infrastructure should reflect that. Not just in size or ambition, but in reliability, functionality, and long-term resilience. That doesn't point to a single ideology. It points to a standard that can be debated, possibly improved, or rethought entirely. And that's where I want to leave this, not with certainty, but with perspective. This channel is called Not in Kansas Anymore, because the world we're trying to understand is complex, and often more interconnected than it first appears. And my goal is not to tell you what to think. It's to slow down the conversation just enough that we can actually see what we're talking about clearly. Thank you for following the series if you did. If not, check it out. I hope this gave you something useful to think about. And I hope to see you in my future videos in 1 week, where I will start in on immigration. But goodbye for now.